This is a mini lecture on implementation as part of a series on bureaucracy and its problems. The study of implementation is associated particularly with this academic, Aaron Wildavsky, who was writing about job creation schemes in the 1970s and why they didn't work. Since he was writing, there's been less interest in implementation, partly because of the rise of new public management ideas, which have focused on the relative efficiency of the private sector in getting things done and assumed that the public sector can't do things very well. Here's a framework for thinking about how policy gets implemented, the kind of conditions under which the implementation takes place, the structural arrangements through which policy is implemented, and the effects on various stages of implementation. But almost as soon as people start writing about implementation, scholars and activists noticed and argued that either lower level officials or the people themselves were the ones that actually made policy. Policy is and should be made from the bottom up. And we notice, for example, in police discretion in the implementation of law and decentralization, that we value and recognize the fact that officials often exercise their own choices about what should and shouldn't be implemented. So people these days tend to talk about a mixture of top-down and bottom-up and the interaction between the two. The managers at the top of organizations want to know how they'll get their version of policy implemented, and here Sabatier sets out some conditions for successful policy implementation, which might be used as a kind of checklist by a manager wanting to ensure their version got through the complicated chain of implementation. There may be special problems of implementation in developing countries. For example, government involvement in housing may involve top-down planning, but also bottom-up implementation by the beneficiaries. And we know that these days policy in developing countries is often made by international organizations, as here is a picture of the IMF and President Sukarno. And policies made from the top down may be resisted by people they affect very deeply, for example in riots over food or over job losses, for example in this riot that we see in Nigeria here. So to end with, I'd like you to think about some issues around with this implementation framework and how it might apply to the particular conditions of either a country you're familiar with or developing countries more generally. What are the differences in conditions in those countries compared to the ones in which the original frameworks would have